Hello, welcome to I Got Board Game again. Welcome back. And on this Friday, it's Friday finally, we will be talking about a pretty influential game in the board gaming world. And so, John, what is that game?
The game is, because Ben actually doesn't have a copy of
I
this.
don't have it.
Gasp!
I don't have it.
Surprise! Shock! Dominion.
Yeah.
Technically, this is the expansion, one of the expansions, but Dominion.
So Dominion. So you guys maybe have heard about Dominion if you've heard of some of the more popular modern board games, along with like Catan, Munchkin, Ticket to Ride. And so this is just a little brief intro on at least what I've learned over the years about Dominion and the series of games. So Dominion is known in the board game world as the grandfather of deck building, right? Deck building, deck builders. And so what a deck building game is, for anyone who doesn't know, is it's not to be confused with like a pre-constructed deck game or, you know, trading card games, collectible card games like Magic the Gathering, Pokemon, My Little Pony, Cardfight Vanguard. There's a lot of those. But deck building is its own mechanic in a game that isn't usually for those kind of competitive card games. And so in those kind of games, those I would call, yeah, like trading card games, TCGs, CCGs, pre-constructed deck games, where
Collectible
you're
card
making
game,
your deck
trading
on your
card
own
game.
outside of the game or outside of when you're playing. And so you bring it ready to play the game with someone. Where deck building as a mechanic that was established by Dominion, deck building is then an actual part of the game itself, where you are collecting cards in the game while you're playing to make your deck as you play. So then you don't have a permanent deck that you put together and bring to every game, but you're always making a new deck every time you play the game. And so and so there are some features that are very common and traditional, established by like Dominion, that are just kind of in all basic deck building games, right? There's always going to be cards that provide you resources in the game, some kind of money. And as you play them, as you take turns and play your cards from your hand, you're generally going to play all your cards if you can. Generally, you can in the beginning. You're going to be playing all the cards, and then that'll gather kind of currency for you on that one turn to buy more cards from the pool of cards. Yeah, they'll have like costs on the cards. You'll be able to buy from the pool of cards that are set up in the middle of the table. And those cards are usually stacks of all the same kind of card, just a certain number of them. So then you can choose which stack to buy a card from with the money you have that turn. And then afterward, you're generally, like I said, playing all your cards. So then you'll discard all the cards at the end of your turn, draw a new hand of cards from the remainder of your deck. And then if you ever run through your deck, you'll just shuffle your discard pile to make your new deck. And so in that way, you're kind of constantly going through this cycle of having a hand of cards, playing all of them, buying cards to add to your discard or your deck later. Then as you draw new cards, those new cards you buy will get shuffled into your deck to be drawn later. And then eventually, these are also usually Euro games or games based around victory points. So you'll eventually want to make sure you buy cards that are worth victory points so that they're in your deck by the end of the game. And whatever triggers the end of the game, such as certain decks running out in the middle or someone reaching a certain card limit or point limit, then everyone will end. You'll go through your individual decks and count how many of those point cards you have, and that's how you determine a winner. And so that is very like common, very, in a sense, the thing you'll always find in basic deck building games. And then there's some modifications that games over the years since Dominion have made. Dominion came out in, I think, 2008.
Something like that. I know Intrigue was copyright 2000. Copyright, where's copyright? Sometime. as I look
And
it
so
up.
yeah, so I think it's been around at least 10
Yeah,
years.
I
And
think
so
2000. This is
and
2009.
yeah. And so my best guess is also that Dominion, this is really just a guess. I haven't read this, but it makes sense to me that Dominion doing deck building is then what's also influenced the whole wave of video games and computer games that do deck building. So people who even play just computer games like might even know this idea of deck building already because so many games do that now as a mechanic in the game too. But I'm guessing it would have started with this board game, like the physical version actually doing something like this,
Mhm.
which was very novel and still having a big influence in games that are coming out today.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, that's kind of some background on what to expect with a game like Dominion. And if that mechanic, I mean, Dominion really is about that mechanic, right? So if that is interesting to you, then yeah, continue listening, maybe even look up the game. It should be very easily obtainable. Like, I think it's also at Targets and places
Yeah,
too.
Dominion's a pretty. It's one of those kind of like what we talked about in the previous videos of like Pandemic, Settlers, in that vein. They all came out around that time, or popularized around that time, and these are as Ben was just describing, is the it has sparked a kind of completely new genre of board games that, you know, hasn't been played. Which is funny that you mention all of that history, because that's really in effect the entire game of Dominion.
Yeah,
There's not really much
that
more
was
to the game in the sense of playing and rules. Like, if you distilled the entire game, that really is the entire game, as just described. But if we're talking about kind of first impressions, or like when we played these games, so the last time I played this game was probably over 10 years ago, honestly. It's been a very long time since I've actually played Dominion for real. But I think it is, for what it was and what it had been at the time, it was definitely something that we hadn't seen in board gaming before. So I think there has been other card games and trading card games that were mentioned, like Magic the Gathering, Pokemon trading card game, Yu-Gi-Oh! You get a lot of these card games where what people know about them is that you have to go out and buy booster packs, right? You have to buy these cards that are sold at the card shops, the comic shops, the game shops, and it's kind of a roulette and kind of gamble, and you're spending money to find the cards that would make the best decks that are out there, right? And so it was kind of a pay to win type of thing, in the sense of you need money in order to be able to play the game. Like, if you really wanted to be serious about playing the game, you had to go out of your way to buy. So Dominion was unique and special because Dominion was one of the first, maybe not the first, if somebody, you know, is history buffing it and going like, nah, this isn't the first deck building game ever. But this is definitely the first popular one that changed card deck games to be something that you could buy one time and you have a complete game within it. And the other cool thing about it is the fact that it had versatility, right? The fact that every game could be different because of the selection of cards. So this is getting into the actual game itself. Is, as we were mentioning, in the deck builder, you need to add cards into your deck to make it grow so that you can get the most points, which up until that point in time, a lot of games are pretty stagnant. We're pretty stagnant about, you only have a set amount of things, or like everybody is the same as a player, and you're not really building things often. You're just kind of playing whatever the game is. But in Dominion, it was special because there's a tableau effectively of 10 different cards that can change every time you play the game. And so each box set usually has about, and I'm showing it to you here, quite a number of different cards so each of these little boxes is a different type of card in the game. And with Dominion, there's, I believe each of the full base games, or like the standalone expansions, had about 40 unique cards per expansion, which is a lot of variability and replayability within a game, where if you have 10 different cards that you could potentially purchase every single time you play the game, but they change every single time you play the game, and they may not be the exact same match or the same pattern. It adds in an element of variety in a game, in a style of game that, again, was pretty revolutionary, right? Like if you play Settlers, it's kind of the same in the sense of you always have the same things, or even some of the games we talked about before, like Splendor, you have the same kind of components, the same gems that you're always taking from every single time. There are some random elements. You can go watch those videos because we talked about those aspects, which is why those are great games too in their own right. But with Dominion, I think that was one of the really big things that was very unique, and it just felt like you had a lot, right? For the investment of buying a board game and the amount of variability that you had was, I think, one of the things that really made it shine in my eyes, because I was a college student at the time, so I was a very poor boy and racked in lots of debt. And it's great to find games that have high dollar value investments to the amount of hours of enjoyment and gameplay that you can get out of it.
Yeah, there's a few things you mentioned and all that, like I think are worth kind of clarifying, and I think are smart, right? Why it was revolutionary for when it came out, and even now, like one of the things is you compared it to those CCGs, TCGs, right, where you're just playing out the game with the cards you brought, and I think that is something that does make Dominion feel very different, where it's not just these are the cards in the game, the ones I'm bringing, the ones my opponent is bringing, and so we're just gonna play, see who had the better cards. In Dominion, because all the cards are face up, like the stacks of cards, yeah, those stacks that John's showing, um, you can see all the cards that you're playing with, right? All the possible things you can add to your deck. And the same thing for every other player, right? They can add those exact same cards that you're looking at. But then it doesn't come down to I brought this deck that plays better, but the point of the game is to make a deck, like in that gameplay session, make a deck that plays better, that can be more efficient, get me points faster than my opponents who have the same options as me. And so that was really revolutionary. And I think even in just a small way, to compare to maybe people's experiences with more traditional card games, like Uno, and you mentioned like Splendor and Catan. It is interesting that you pointed out that in those games you have just like maybe basically like one deck of cards, right, that you randomly draw from. Where again, in Dominion, you can see the cards that you're going to be buying. Like obviously you can't see what you're drawing from your own deck, but the big part is the cards that you can add to your deck. And so you can see it all. And so it's not just one deck and randomly getting something, but 10 decks, if you will, and you're choosing what to take from. And so and then obviously you mentioned and you showed that there's all these other decks that you can mix in. And so that's where, yeah, a lot of people point out the replayability of Dominion, that you only choose 10 of those decks for each game. And then there's like a number of decks, right? Like 15, 20 at least. And so
something like that. It's a lot.
You can mix and match basically a lot of ways. And so, yeah, those are like 3 points I thought of when you were talking that, yeah, really it made it revolutionary.
Yeah, and I think that when we're talking kind of the style of the game of what kind of draws people, what I found draws people into playing the game is that it's a competition, but it's not necessarily a direct competition, which I'll also talk about in terms of whether I think this is a really great game or not, is the fact that the competition of this game is it's a lot more of a strategy game, right? In the sense of, and I think we alluded to it already, is how do I build or make a deck and put it together in a way that allows for me to get the most points at the end of the game, or however you trigger it. So in Dominion, the trigger is, I think there's the highest level kind of point card that you can buy if that deck runs out, or if 3 other piles as you're playing the game run out of cards. And then that triggers the end game, ensures that everybody has a final turn in the round, and then the game is over. And then you count the points that are in your deck. So, and this is the part that the strategy is very interesting, because depending on the cards that are out, as well as your kind of mentality or how you play games, there's a lot of different ways you can go about buying and setting up your deck. As we were saying, the main thing is putting cards into your deck that effectively let you buy more cards, that let you get more points over time. There's also cards that let you get rid of cards out of your deck as well. And then the interesting thing for Dominion, the way that they set it up, is that typically the cards that give you points are cards that don't really have a value, don't really provide you any value while you're playing the game, but they give you value when but they're the condition that lets you win the game at the end.
Yeah,
Which,
that's actually what I wanted to also point out, that
yeah.
I think it's the way that I think the design doesn't come off stale when you actually play it. Because from what I just described in the beginning of this video, I can imagine people thinking like, oh, so I just have money cards and I draw them and then buy point cards and then just hope to draw more money cards to buy point cards.
Point
Right?
card.
That would be really stale, right? It's just
Money
like
card.
really chance of what you draw. But keep in mind, like all those different decks of cards, like they do different things. They aren't just points or money. But in Dominion, like they give you certain actions, right? They give you more actions on your turn so you could buy more. You need actions to buy. Or it gives you other ways to get money faster, such as like cards that count as more money if you played it on the same turn as another card. Or there's cards that can put cards into other people's deck to give them negative points.
In the later expansions.
Yeah, stuff like that. And so that's what you should have in mind with the other decks of cards, why there's so much variety, that they actually do different things than just money and points.
Exactly.
It's all serving that purpose of somehow getting enough money on your turn to buy more points, but there's a lot of creativity in the ways that it does it, and that kind of then makes you think how you can make your deck around that.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think then that kind of moves into a little bit of my impressions about the game as well. That I think it's a very simple game in terms of what you can do in the game. There's basically two primary phases in your turn. The first phase typically is your actions phase, where you're playing these cards that we were just mentioning that aren't the cards that give you money to buy things, but allow you to do different things, whether it's gaining cards from the tableau of cards, whether it's, as we were saying, adding more cards or taking away cards or adding them into other people's decks, or even changing people's hands. There are some cards that allow you to shift cards between people's hands or their decks, things like that. And so that's kind of the first phase typically of a person's turn, round on their turn. And then the second phase is typically the buying phase. And so the interesting thing about the game is at a base level, you only have one action card that you can play on a turn and one buy during your turn, right? You can only purchase one single card with money. But the reason why the playing of the cards is very important is that there are cards that can add more actions for you to take during your turn. And there are also cards that allow you to buy more than one card at a time during your buying phase. And I think that's the part where at the beginning of the game, there's a limitation to how much you can buy or how much you can do initially. But as you build up this deck, I think that's the part that makes it really also special and interesting, is that it's something that you're crafting together, right? This deck is something that, based on your knowledge and your experience and your thought process, you are putting together this deck and seeing how well and how able is it to purchase or buy the things that you need to buy or want to buy in the long run for the game. And I think that's also a part that makes it very cool in that sense of what it was at first too, because the theme of the game is Dominion. So you're actually supposedly playing as lords and ladies of estates and things like that. And you're trying to win and curry favor and valor points or something, victory points or whatever. And I mean, and that's kind of the theme of the game. And so it's all of these cards are thematically noted as things from kind of medieval times, of like different types of cards, of like the chapels, your trading posts, your peasants, like you're getting more gold, you have your duchies and your estates that you're purchasing for points because that's building your kingdom. But then the individual people are these actions that you take. It's as if you're going out into whether they come to you to petition for something or you're going out into your state, right? Like that's the theoretical aspect of the game thematically. I would say, and maybe Ben will talk to this, the theme isn't really super part of this game. You could substitute it with almost anything and it wouldn't change anything about the game. But I think at least having that light theme to it kind of gives you the sense of why you would be building this deck and why it kind of is this development of your kingdom, your duchy, your dominion over the lands. Title drop.
So actually, before kind of asking John for what if he likes Dominion and deck builders, I would say it is kind of on that last point that John mentioned about the theme. That's why I would say I don't have a copy of Dominion anymore. I bought Hinterlands back when we were in Berkeley, and we did play that. That's one of these standalone expansions, meaning you can add it to a base game or it can function as a base game in itself. But I think overall it was because I care a lot about themes in my games, like nice art. The art in Dominion is okay. It's not bad, but it definitely has like an older style. And again, not like older style like grainy or pixelated, but just those kind of like more medieval kind of times themes,
Of course, I chose the harem card to show there.
and so yeah, overall the art's like okay, but thematically I didn't really get into the theme, and for me it just kind of showed me that deck building is a really clever mechanic, but it doesn't draw me enough if it doesn't feel more than playing like a really clever mechanic. But then John, what are your thoughts about Dominion?
Yeah, I think so. So I think it holds a place of nostalgia for me in terms of this style and this kind of way of playing a game in general, right? Because I think even Ben mentioned there are a lot of games that have developed since Dominion's time and since Dominion has come out in not just board gaming industry, but especially in the video game industry. It is blown up. It has, if you are a gamer, like if you look at Steam, especially in the indie space, there is a lot of games and a lot of indie developers that are starting to create a ton of games that use the base mechanic of deck building, where you start out with a very limited set of cards and over time you are creating a deck over time. There's tons of games, like we won't go into them because it's not a video
there's
game.
like new ones like every month.
Yeah.
I mean, super successful ones. I will just mention like Slay the Spire.
Slay the Spire is the biggest one.
Recently, a fun one that we've played is One Step from Eden.
So that one's more a different game style.
Yeah. I mean, but it's still deck building.
It's a style. Yeah,
it's a part of it. Monster Train was a very recent one. So yeah, video game wise, there's a lot of those.
Yeah, and so kind of to my feelings about it, I think the mechanic and the sense and the mechanic of having a base deck that everyone starts with and then is able to build it out and expand it in a way that's special and unique to your style of trying to make the most efficient or the deck. I think I really liked that part. That's why like I used to play this game for hours on end with friends when we were in college. We would literally get in a room, like one of our rooms in the apartments, and then we would just play for hours, and not necessarily to the happiness of our Bible study groups and such, though we were very responsible. We didn't miss anything, but we did spend a lot of time playing these games. And I think it's really fun because once people kind of know how to play the game, you can actually play these games really fast too, right? Like the nice thing about these styles of games is if people know what they're doing, you can move pretty quickly. And one of the things about a lot of games is sometimes the fatigue or like the analysis paralysis that can happen. A lot of times you're trying to make decisions, but with the deck builder, you kind of know what your deck is as you're building it already. And rather than having to spend a long time thinking about what should the next action be, you're just looking at your hand and you're looking at like what you have, what as you're drawing, and you can just, and then you just play it based on what you've drawn. Though this is where my criticisms kind of come in a little bit with the game is I think because Dominion was the first ever and that its primary fundamental mechanic is just the essence of deck building games, is that it's very simple also in the long run, in the sense of as a deck builder, and especially nowadays thinking about all the new deck builders that have come out since that time, I don't know if I would easily come back to this or want to play it as much as I used to, just because all you're really doing in this game is making a deck for yourself. And I think that's also a criticism that I've had, even my friends after we played it like extensively kind of recognize, is that there's really not a lot of interaction with other players in this game. You're really just kind of doing your own thing. And there are some cards that can affect other players, but it's pretty limited for the most part. Like you're really not affecting other people other than what you're buying on the table. And for a deck builder, especially for a competitive or Euro style deck builder, it almost feels like you would expect there to, especially with a theme too, and this maybe goes back into why the theme doesn't feel as nice, is that you would expect this game to have more interaction with people, because if you're supposedly building up a dominion of your lands, if you're supposedly building this, you kind of, it almost has the sense of like, shouldn't there be some form of like either political intrigue or some kind of warfare that could be happening in this, right? Because it's the whole idea is you're building up your lands, but the game doesn't really have that very much. Again, we mentioned there's a few cards, and maybe future expansions did do this. We are speaking only up to like the 4th expansion, which was like 2010. So, and we know there are a lot more Dominions that have come out since then, but from even up to 4 expansions, it really didn't add that much more in that way. So I would say that that's kind of the problem I see with the game in the long run of why it's not always the most fun, because it ends up becoming more of a heady game. So people who like puzzling, who like trying to figure out how to build efficient decks or build efficient strategies, it fits more for their style, versus if you're looking for more player interaction or more direct competition with people, this game doesn't really have that same, it doesn't have the same kind of feeling, because points are all hidden, because they're all in your decks. So it's only dependent on whether you can remember how many cards someone has bought. You can kind of gauge it if you're looking at the decks and counting the cards, because all of the decks that you're buying from have a certain amount. So you could technically card count that way if you really wanted to, but generally speaking, it's surprising for the style and this theme of a game to not really have any other interactions with other players, which I think is kind of I would say that's the biggest criticism that I've had about this game.
Which I think is not that big of a criticism, since that just is characteristic of, the broad category of Euro games, right?
Yeah.
Even like Splendor we talked about the other time, it fits into that category, right? Games that are actually, purposely not about direct conflict, generally about victory points versus like killing each other, stuff like that. And so I don't find that as a big issue with the game for me, and so that is something, if you are interested in like a game where you are like kind of plotting and trying to outpace other players versus directly just like bashing them. I mean, I think that's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
And I would say, I mean, going back a little, one thing I did want to mention before we kind of wrap up was something I do really like about the deck building mechanic, which was interesting to learn when playing, was I know you mentioned certain cards being allow you to like remove cards from your deck. And I remember the first time I heard about that, just the first time when playing Dominion, it's like, why would I ever do that? Like in a lot of games, it's like, I want more cards. Like if you played like War, that simple with poker cards game, it's like, I want more cards, I want the high cards, but I need all the cards to win. Or, just a lot of cases you think like, if I just have more, that's better, you know. But in this game, in most deck builders, a key part to learn is how to make an efficient deck, right?
The
Because if
balance.
you remember, like you're always adding cards to your deck. It's like, oh, I want to do this card's ability and that card's ability. But eventually, if you keep adding all these things that you want to do, the chances of you drawing it on your turn to actually do it decreases.
And that's the thing that I
Yeah.
don't think we mentioned that from like a gameplay wise, right? Is that you only draw 5 cards at the start of every one of your turns. So you start out with a small deck, so you're typically seeing your cards very quickly. But if you're buying more and more cards, the deck isn't getting smaller, it's growing. So no longer do you have 10 cards, you now have 20 cards. You don't have 20 cards, you end up with 30 cards. And to draw through, once you play the cards, typically when they're in your discard pile, you can't use them again until you reshuffle the deck to use them again. So if you have really good cards that you like and you've used them, typically you want to see them again and you want to use them as quickly as possible. But if you have a big deck, then you're not going to shuffle that until you go through all the other 25 potential cards that maybe aren't so good for your deck.
Yeah,
So
so I think that is one of the really cool things about deck builders. So I'm not here to bash on Dominion. I want to put that clever point out there in
yeah,
the
and I think my reaction right now is more of the fact that now that we've seen since Dominion's release and since Dominion has actually, as we said, has like is considered the kind of grandfather and influencer of all deck builders since then, right? Like this is the iconic game of deck builders. And there are many other deck builders that board game deck builders that have been created since then too, that have taken this base mechanic and then added in new things and changed things in ways that add some variety into not just being a clone of Dominion, but as their own styles and types of games, with keeping true to what it means to be a deck builder, but then adding in more competitive elements or other ways of collecting points versus being within the deck itself as a limitation or things like that.
So in saying that, I do want to show, I'm going to try to share the screen of the Board Game Geek page for Dominion. It
Should we
does
give our own
have
personal ratings first?
my rating,
Oh,
which I just
I should
edited
look at
because I
yours.
didn't think it was fair. No, I just edited it.
No.
So I would give it a 6, which sounds low. But for those of you who are new to Board Game Geek, when you try to give a game a rating, it does kind of have its own scale. And so I don't know if you can see on the side, it's like, or let me see. Like if I hover over it, did it show it? Yeah, so
I
like
think
6
it's
is
just
like
showing your
good, usually willing to play, and then like 5 is like okay. Oh no, 6 is okay. 7 is usually willing to
good,
play.
willing to play.
5 is like take it or leave it. So I would give Dominion more credit than take it or leave it. I would say it's definitely worth trying,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not up to a 7 where I'm usually willing to play. Like I'm usually willing to play any other deck builder that has come after that John mentioned. Like some that I do want to mention, which we'll probably talk about in a future video. And you guys can comment, let us know if you want to hear them sooner. But like Clank is a big one that came probably 4 years ago, 4 or 5, 4 years ago.
Like that, yeah.
That was a big one where it's kind of falls into what John mentioned of taking deck building and adding something and making it more competitive, where it's deck building plus kind of adventuring through a dungeon. So there's both cards and a board where you have to move along to try to get treasure and get out, basically. And then there's also Aeon's End, which was a big one by Indie Boards and Cards, which has had a few expansions too. And that one, it was more deck building, but it changed up a lot of the fundamental mechanics in deck building. Like I mentioned, the whole playing all your cards every turn, and then like drawing back up, where in Aeon's End, the order that you discard your cards matters because you don't actually shuffle your discard when you remake your deck. You just flip it over. And so the order that you discarded will affect the order that you draw later. And then that one also has more fighting. That one is actually cooperative, which is important to mention. So it's a co-op deck building game where you are mages, magicians fighting some enemy together. So there's that kind of your cards in that are also like spells and combat cards.
Mhm.
So those are two big ones that I think of. But I would almost always rather play those than Dominion.
Yeah, and I think I would probably say a 7 for me. Again, partly nostalgia and
You can
partly
go higher, John.
because
I know you want to go higher.
no, because as you're saying, like if I had a choice between two different deck builders, like I would always choose another deck builder over this one, just because this one is so, in my mind, pretty basic, right? There's really not a lot to do, and if you have another deck builder that adds a different mechanic that makes it more interesting, then I'm all like, I think I mentioned it. I've mentioned it previously. It's like I like complex games. I like games that make things have a lot of things you need to track, a lot of things you need to work with and keep track of and build. It's just what I like. I enjoy having that kind of trying to understand all of these pieces and components. So for me, Dominion, and it might be because I have played Dominion so much too. So maybe I'm slightly influenced by it of what I used to be. But I would probably say a 7 because if someone were to ask if I wanted to play and stuff, like I would probably be like, yeah, let's play. Again, if they said, but if you want to play with Clank, do you want to play that instead? I'd be like, let's go play Clank instead because Clank is just better than Dominion as
I
a game,
would probably be that guy.
right?
Like
Right?
someone will be like, "Hey, John, you want to play Dominion?" It's like, okay, and I'll be like, "Or would you rather play Clank?" And we would play
Let's play
Clank.
Clank instead, right? But this is not a review of Clank. This is a review of Dominion. I do think this is a very like if you're interested in just learning about what deck builders are, it's a good game. It's a very solid game. The mechanics are not super complicated. It's pretty easy. The nice thing about the cards in this game too is that they're pretty descriptive about what they do. They're pretty self-explanatory. There's maybe one or two in the old editions that maybe weren't the best in some like one card being kind of a little bit wonky because of a very specific situation you get yourself into, which makes it weird. But otherwise, like the text explains itself. They don't throw in a bunch of weird like I'll say magic words like Magic the Gathering words where it's just like you have to know exactly what that term means. Otherwise, you're gonna have no idea what that action stands for until you
Like made
learn
up
it.
keywords.
Yeah, like a
Yeah.
bunch of just these keywords that like somewhat intuitive, but then it's also like, you have to like learn it, right? But with Dominion, you don't. Dominion, you can just kind of you could just start a game, and as long as somebody knows how the turns work, you could just read the cards and know how to play the game at that point. Like it's that simple of a game, which I think is good, and I think it's nice to have. Versus again, if we were to try to start someone on something like Aeon's End as their first deck builder ever, or Clank even,
Yeah.
it might be a little too much, right?
Yeah. I
And
agree.
I say that as introduction, like people who are introducing themselves into the genre. This is a good starting point if you're interested in this concept. Um, and then it is your gateway into all of the other wonderful board games that have come out since
That's
then.
yeah. That's why Dominion, yeah, is a gateway game, and
Yep.
yeah, hopefully you guys seeing my screen and Board Game Geek. I mean, after more than 10 years, it's still top 100 overall game lists and top 100 strategy games. So it is still really solid. And there are people like on the Dice Tower, Tom Bassel still really likes Dominion. And so, yeah, it is one that, like John was saying, I would recommend if this is your first try at deck building and really seeing what it's like. Um, and so, aside from that, uh, I would just mention if you're interested in finding Dominion, we mentioned there's a lot of versions and expansions. And so I think a couple years ago, uh, like the first and second base game, like just plain Dominion and then Dominion Intrigue, those were reprinted. So I think those have second editions.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, then there's also Hinterlands, which is another expansion, standalone expansion, which you can get as it's a base game.
Yeah.
Uh, and then there's a lot of other expansions. So just be careful not to just buy an expansion like Alchemy is
Archages, for
Prosperity.
example.
Oh
It
yeah,
should
yeah.
say
So it'll
specifically.
say. I mean, yeah, expansions will almost always say that you need the base game. So just be aware. All the base games come in that kind of square box
Yeah,
shape, though, that John was showing, like that
kind of
exact
a big
same
box.
size. So yeah, I would encourage you guys to check it out if this deck building mechanic sounds interesting to you, sounds novel to you.
Reach out.
My score is 6. John's is 7. And yeah, and feel free to comment if you actually are curious about some of the other deck builders we mentioned, and that can kind of push it down the line for us to talk about it sooner. Uh, I don't know if you had anything else to add about Dominion, John?
Do I have anything else? Oh, just beware the torturer and beware the witch. That's all I have to say.
The witch. I remember the witch. I remember the witch. I like the witch.
We
But
banned
yeah,
those cards at one point because they were so tiring to play against.
but yeah, thank you guys for watching, and hopefully this was a helpful introduction to Dominion, to deck building, and if you found it interesting, hope you'll share this with your friends also. And until next time, we'll see you then.
See you there.
Bye.
It says we're still recording. Is this the bloopers time? Bloopers.
Sorry, hold on.